He was not following a dog through the storm. He was following the only living thing that still seemed to know where hope was buried. The dust came over the Arizona flats like a wall, brown and roaring, swallowing the highway, the dry washes, the low black teeth of the distant mountains. By the time Sergeant Caleb Walker stepped out of the stalled transport truck, the world had narrowed to 10 feet of sand and noise. Grit struck his face like handfuls of ground glass. The wind dragged at his desert jacket, filled the folds of his sleeves, and turned every breath into a rough prayer. Somewhere behind him, the convoy lights blinked weakly through the haze, amber ghosts fading in and out. The radio gave only static. No voices, no directions, just a cracked hiss that sounded too much like the last thing a man hears before silence becomes permanent. Caleb was 36, broad-shouldered, white, and weathered by years in uniform, with close-cut dark blonde hair hidden under a dust-caked cap and pale blue eyes that had learned to measure danger without wasting fear. He had crossed deserts before. He knew how wind could erase a road, a footprint, a promise. But this storm felt different. It had come too fast. 1 minute the sky had been hard and empty above the training route outside Yuma, and the next, the sun vanished behind a moving wall of earth. The vehicle slowed. Then one stopped. Then another. Then the lead truck reported a mechanical failure, and after that, the radio began breaking apart. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd standing beside him. Ranger did not tremble. The 6-year-old K9 stood lean and steady, sable coat rippling under the blast of sand, black mask dusted tan, amber eyes fixed on something Caleb could not see. His ears cut forward. His nose lifted. Not high, not searching randomly, but locked onto a thread inside the storm. Caleb had seen that look only twice before. Once before a hidden training charge was found under a tire. Once before a lost recruit was discovered dehydrated in a ravine. Ranger did not guess. Ranger knew. "Easy, boy," Caleb said, though the words disappeared almost as soon as they left his mouth. The dog took one step into the storm, then another. Caleb tightened his grip on the lead. "No, we stay with the convoy." Ranger stopped and turned his head. There was no panic in him, no impatience, just that still, almost human gaze, the kind that made Caleb feel less like a handler and more like a man being asked to trust something older than orders. A hard gust shoved sand across the road and rattled the truck doors. Somewhere ahead, metal groaned softly, loose and tired. Caleb glanced back toward the convoy. Marines moved as shadows, securing gear, checking each other, waiting for instructions that were not coming clearly enough. Everyone was doing what they were trained to do. Hold position, stay together, survive the weather. Then Ranger whined once. Low, broken, not fear, not complaint. A warning wrapped in grief. Caleb felt the small hairs rise along the back of his neck. "What is it?" Ranger pulled again, not hard enough to disobey, but firmly enough to say there was no time to explain. Caleb stared into the storm where the dog wanted to go. There was nothing there but dust, scrub, and a drainage basin about a quarter-mile off the shoulder, invisible now beneath the churning brown air. He remembered the route brief from that morning. Old service roads, abandoned ranch structures, a dry creek bed cutting through the flats. Nothing active, nothing worth risking a K9 team in zero visibility. But Ranger was already facing it again, body low, tail steady, every muscle tuned to a sound beneath the wind. Caleb unclipped the safety strap from his vest and looped the lead twice around his glove. He did not know why his chest had tightened. He did not know why the storm suddenly seemed less like weather and more like a curtain drawn over something waiting. "All right," he whispered. "Show me." Ranger moved at once. Not running, leading. Caleb followed, boots sinking into soft sand as they left the edge of the road and stepped into a world without shape. The convoy vanished behind them after 20 paces. The truck lights became blurred sparks, then nothing. The wind pressed against Caleb's ribs, pushed grit into his teeth, and stole the warmth from his breath. He kept one hand on the lead and one hand shielding his eyes, trusting the small, constant pull ahead. Ranger's paws found the ground with impossible certainty. Around them, the storm screamed over creosote bushes and dry stones. A plastic water jug rolled past Caleb's boot, thumping once, then disappearing into brown. He wanted to call it off. Every rule in his head told him to turn back before the road was gone completely. But then Ranger stopped, so suddenly Caleb nearly stepped into him. The dog stood rigid, staring toward a low dip in the earth. Caleb heard it then, not over the wind. Under it, a faint sound, small, repeating, almost swallowed by the storm. At first he thought it was a loose hinge. Then it came again, thinner, softer, carrying through the dust like a thread of life. Ranger looked back at him, eyes bright with urgency. Caleb's throat went dry. He crouched beside the dog, the storm curling around them like smoke. "You heard that all the way from the road," he murmured. Ranger did not move. He only faced the sound, waiting. And in that moment, before Caleb saw what lay ahead, before the storm gave up its secret, he understood something that made him very still. This was not a K9 chasing scent. This was a soul answering a call no human had been able to hear. Caleb took a deep breath, letting the grit sting his lungs and the wind whip against his face. Ranger's paws pressed into the sand with unerring precision, a rhythm that seemed almost musical despite the chaos around them. Every step forward was a negotiation with the elements, each movement a careful balance between trust and instinct. The faint sound beneath the storm grew clearer, a subtle pulse carried on the shifting air, fragile but insistent. Caleb tightened his grip on the lead, feeling the vibration in Ranger's chest, the silent communication they had trained for over years in the desert and on the training fields. Ahead, a shallow dip revealed the dark shape of a forgotten wash, once a trickle of water in wetter months, now filled with scattered debris, sun-bleached and wind-worn. Shadow paused at its edge, tail low, ears pointed, and Caleb mirrored the dog's tension, kneeling slightly, scanning every contour, every shadow that could betray movement. The faint noises came again, higher now, and Caleb realized it was not wind or sand but a rhythm of life, small and persistent. He whispered, "Show me where," and Ranger gave a single, decisive bark, a sharp punctuation in the storm. The dog advanced into the wash with deliberate steps, and Caleb followed, boots sinking into powdery sand, each footfall heavy with caution. A broken wooden crate, half buried in the grit, revealed itself, its planks warped and splintered. Something small moved inside, tentative and fragile. Caleb leaned closer, hand outstretched, eyes straining, heart pounding. Shadow waited, alert, his body a living compass pointing to the crate. The tiny shape inside shivered against the wind, amber eyes meeting Caleb's with a mixture of fear and relief. Caleb spoke softly, steadying his own breath so as not to alarm it, murmuring reassurance. "It is okay. You are safe now." The pup trembled and pressed closer to the wood, instinctively seeking the warmth of a guardian, and Caleb felt a wave of quiet understanding pass between himself and Shadow. The storm continued to howl around them, a torrent of sand and wind, yet in that small moment, the world narrowed to the wash, the crate, the small life within, and the unbroken bond guiding Caleb forward. Ranger nudged the crate gently with his nose, prompting the pup to emerge, hesitant but trusting. Caleb knelt fully now, arms open, welcoming the pup, feeling the fine dust settle around them like a veil, and he whispered, "You are not alone anymore." Shadow pressed close, amber eyes scanning every corner, ensuring nothing remained unseen, a sentinel in the heart of chaos. Caleb felt a shiver of relief, realizing the storm, though merciless, had not broken their resolve. The pup wriggled free from the crate and nestled against Caleb's side, tiny paws brushing against the folds of his jacket, a quiet affirmation of trust earned in seconds yet felt as if it had existed for lifetimes. Caleb looked down at Shadow, eyes meeting in silent agreement, a shared acknowledgement of duty fulfilled and lives preserved. The desert around them was still a raging wall of dust, but within the wash, a pocket of calm had formed, carried by the instinct and faith of a dog and the readiness of the Marine beside him. For a long moment, Caleb simply allowed himself to feel the weight of the storm, the grit on his skin, the sound of the pup's breathing mingling with the wind, and the certainty that they had followed the right guide, a bond invisible yet stronger than the blinding chaos surrounding them. Shadow pressed closer to Caleb, warm fur brushing his sleeve, a tactile reminder that even amid uncertainty, guidance, and loyalty could pierce through the harshest elements. Caleb adjusted the pup in his arms, careful not to startle, letting the tiny heartbeat settle against his own, and with one final glance at the wash around them, he realized that this moment, small yet profound, had become the axis on which the storm's fury could no longer tilt their world. He rose slowly, lifting the pup gently, Ranger at his side, each step purposeful, a measured cadence against the roar of wind, sand, and uncertainty, feeling the unity of purpose that had guided them from the road to this fragile sanctuary. In that endless desert swirl, Caleb understood that following a signal, trusting instinct, and honoring the bond between man and dog could turn even the most merciless storm into a passage of hope, and the dust-laden horizon now seemed less like a threat and more like a corridor opening towards something awaiting, quietly, silently, but unmistakably real. Caleb had taken only 5 steps back toward the road when Ranger stopped again. Not slowed. Stopped. The German shepherd planted all 4 paws in the sand and turned his head toward the far side of the wash, where the storm folded over the ground in thick brown sheets. Caleb felt the lead go firm in his hand. The pup tucked inside his jacket gave a faint whimper, so small it almost vanished beneath the wind. Caleb lowered his chin, shielding the little body with his forearm. "Ranger," he said, his voice rough but calm, "we found him. We need to get back." The dog did not look at him. His ears were forward, his body still as a statue carved out of dust and duty. Then Caleb heard it again. Not the same sound. This one was deeper, slower, a dull, uneven tapping from somewhere beyond the broken crate, as if something loose was shifting against metal. Caleb squinted through the storm. At first, he saw only sand whipping sideways and gray scrub bending flat under the gusts. Then the dust thinned for one brief second, and a shape appeared near the bottom of the wash. It was the outline of an old utility trailer, half buried at an angle, its faded white sides almost the same color as the storm. Caleb's breath caught. The pup in his jacket pressed closer to his chest, and Ranger gave a low sound from deep in his throat, not a growl, not alarm, but insistence. Caleb understood then that the puppy had not been the whole reason. The puppy had been the first sign. The door to the trailer hung crooked, opening and closing a few inches with every push of wind. Tap. Pause. Tap. It was not loud, but in the strange pocket between gusts, it sounded painfully human, like a weak hand trying to be heard. Caleb moved toward it, keeping his shoulder turned to protect the pup. His boots slid down the sandy slope, and he had to plant one knee briefly to steady himself. Ranger moved ahead, then waited, checking back the way a good partner does, never abandoning, never rushing so far that trust has to break to keep up. When they reached the trailer, Caleb saw old ranch lettering faded beneath dust and sun. No fresh tracks were visible. The storm had erased everything. Ranger nosed the gap at the door, then stepped back. Caleb leaned close. "Hello," he called. The wind stole the word. He tried again, louder. "United States Marine. Is anybody inside?" For a moment there was nothing. Only sand. Only the door tapping. Then, from within the dark, came a soft sound. A breath. A shift. A voice so faint it seemed ashamed to exist. "Please." Caleb went still. Not from fear. From the sudden weight of being needed. He set the pup carefully inside the front of his jacket, securing the zipper just enough to hold warmth around the small body, then reached for the door. It resisted at first, stuck against sand piled at the bottom. Ranger pressed his shoulder beside Caleb's leg, as if bracing. With him, Caleb pulled slowly, carefully, until the door opened wide enough for light to spill inside. A dry smell met him first. Old canvas, sun-baked wood, dust, and something like stale water. Inside, seated on the floor beside a stack of folded tarps, was an elderly man in a denim jacket and a wide-brimmed hat bent low over his knees. His face was pale beneath the dust, his white beard trembling with each breath, and one hand rested protectively over a small metal carrier beside him. He was not bleeding. He was not screaming. He was simply exhausted in the quiet way that frightened Caleb more than noise ever could. "Sir," Caleb said gently, crouching at the doorway, "my name is Sergeant Caleb Walker. I am going to help you out of here." The old man blinked as if the words had to travel a long distance to reach him. His eyes shifted from Caleb to Ranger, and something softened in them. "That dog," he whispered. "I heard him." Caleb looked at Ranger, whose amber eyes were fixed on the carrier. From inside came a tiny rustle. Caleb opened it slowly and found 2 more German Shepherd puppies curled together in a towel, dusty, weak, but breathing. For a moment, the storm seemed to fall silent around him, though it did not. His throat tightened so quickly he had to look away. The puppy inside his jacket stirred, as if recognizing the scent of the others. Ranger stepped closer and lowered his nose to the carrier, touching it once with impossible gentleness. The old man swallowed. "I was taking them to my daughter near Phoenix," he said, each word thin and careful. "Truck quit. Storm came fast. I brought them in here to keep the sand off. Thought someone might pass after it cleared." Caleb nodded, though he knew how close that hope had come to fading unseen beneath miles of dust. He spoke softly into the radio on his shoulder, adjusting the angle, praying the signal would catch. Static answered first. Then a broken voice from the convoy cut through, distant but real. Caleb gave their position as clearly as he could, using the wash, the abandoned trailer, the distance from the road. When he finished, he looked back at the old man, at the carrier, at Ranger standing between them and the storm like a promise with fur and breath. "Help is coming," Caleb said. The old man closed his eyes, not in surrender, in relief. And Caleb, kneeling there with 1 puppy warm against his heart and 2 more breathing in the dust-dark trailer, understood why Ranger had refused to turn back. Some calls are too quiet for radios. Some lives are hidden too low for headlights. And sometimes the only one who can hear mercy asking to be found is a dog who has never forgotten how to listen. The radio clicked once, then dissolved into static again, but Caleb had heard enough to believe they were no longer alone in the storm. He lowered his hand from the shoulder mic and listened. The old trailer creaked softly around them, its thin walls breathing in the wind. Dust slipped through narrow seams and pale ribbons, settling over the tarps, the cracked floor, the old man's boots, and Ranger's sable coat. Caleb shifted carefully, keeping the first puppy warm inside his jacket while the 2 in the carrier stirred beneath the towel. Their tiny breaths came uneven but steady, little threads of life holding on inside a place the desert had nearly swallowed. "What is your name, sir?" Caleb asked. The old man lifted his eyes slowly. "Walter Briggs," he said. "Most folks call me Walt." His voice had the dry rasp of a man who had spent too many hours breathing dust and too many years pretending he did not need help. Caleb nodded. "Mr. Briggs, I need to check if you can stand." Walt tried to move before Caleb finished, stubborn pride rising faster than strength, but his hand trembled against the floorboards, and he sat back with a weary exhale. Ranger stepped closer, not touching him, just lowering his head until his amber eyes were level with Walt's. The old man stared at the dog for a long second, and the lines in his face loosened. "You found us," he whispered. Ranger blinked once, calm and solemn, as if this had never been in question. Caleb pulled a canteen from his vest and offered it. Small sips. Walt obeyed, and the water seemed to bring color back into his cheeks by degrees. Outside, the storm surged again. Sand struck the trailer like rain against a tin roof, thousands of tiny impacts merging into a restless roar. Caleb turned toward the open door and saw almost nothing beyond 5 feet. No road, no convoy lights, no sign of the rescue team, only a world made of brown motion. He closed the door most of the way, leaving just enough space for air, then removed 1 glove and touched the nearest puppy through the towel. "Warm, but barely. They need heat," he said. Walt looked at the carrier with quiet shame. "I had blankets in the truck. Could not get back to it after the wind took over." Caleb did not answer with blame. There was none to give. Some storms arrive like a test no one studied for. He removed the outer layer of his field jacket, folded it over the carrier, and tucked the edges down to block the dust. The puppy inside his shirt shifted, pressing 1 paw against his chest. Caleb felt that small pressure through the fabric and thought of how fragile a life could be, how it could weigh almost nothing and still become heavier than every order in a man's memory. Ranger suddenly turned toward the rear of the trailer. His ears rose. Caleb followed his gaze. Beneath the folded tarps, something made a faint scraping sound. Walt noticed it too and frowned. There should not be anything back there. Caleb raised 1 hand, asking for stillness. The scraping came again, light and uncertain. Ranger moved forward one step, then stopped, waiting for permission. Caleb whispered, "Search." The dog approached the tarps carefully, nose working, body low but gentle. He nudged the edge with his muzzle. A small gap opened, and from beneath the canvas came a soft whine. Caleb crouched and pulled the tarp back slowly. There, pressed against the wall in a shallow pocket of dust, lay a fourth puppy, smaller than the others, almost hidden completely beneath the canvas. For a second, Caleb did not breathe. The little pup's sable fur was coated pale with sand, making him look like part of the floor itself. His eyes were closed, his body curled tight, but when Ranger touched him with the side of his nose, the puppy moved. Barely. Enough. Walt covered his mouth with one shaking hand. "I thought there were only 3, he said, his voice breaking into a whisper. Caleb slid both hands under the tiny body with the care of lifting a candle in the wind. Not anymore. He brought the puppy close, warming him between his palms, then tucked him inside his shirt beside the first. The 2 small bodies pressed together, one stronger, one weaker, both alive. Ranger stood so close that Caleb could feel the dog's breath against his wrist. The German shepherd did not wag his tail. He did not celebrate. He simply watched, as if counting, as if making sure heaven had not been shortchanged by one. Caleb looked at him then, really looked, and a strange peace moved through him despite the storm and the dust and the uncertainty pressing against the trailer walls. Ranger had not brought him to a rescue. He had brought him to a family hidden in pieces. First one cry, then an old man, then 2 pups and a carrier, then the smallest one, almost missed by every human sense. Caleb swallowed hard and keyed the radio again. "Convoy, this is Walker. Update. We have 1 adult civilian and 4 puppies sheltered in the trailer. Repeat, for puppies." The answer came in broken waves, but the words reached him. "Copy, Walker. Hold position. We are coming to you." Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. Not long enough to rest, just long enough to give thanks. When he opened them, Walt was staring at Ranger with wet eyes and a kind of reverence that did not need a church to be understood. "That dog heard the one nobody knew was missing," Walt said. Caleb rested one dusty hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath the fur. "Yes, sir," he said softly. He did. Outside, the storm kept raging, but inside the trailer, every living thing had been counted, and that made the darkness feel less powerful than before. For the next several minutes, the trailer became a small island of breath and waiting. Caleb sat with his back against the thin metal wall, one knee raised, the 2 smallest puppies tucked safely inside his shirt where his body heat could reach them. The other 2 rested in the carrier beneath the folded jacket, their noses hidden under the towel, their tiny bodies making the faintest sounds whenever the wind shook the floor. Walt sat across from him, holding the canteen in both hands as if it were something sacred. Ranger stayed near the door, not asleep, not restless, just watching. His sable coat had turned the color of the desert. Dust settled along his spine and muzzle, and yet his amber eyes remained clear, bright, patient. Caleb had seen Marines hold a perimeter with less discipline than that dog. Every few seconds, Ranger lifted his nose toward the crack in the door, reading the storm with senses no instrument could match. Caleb listened too, but all he heard was the low thunder of sand sliding over the earth and the occasional broken voice of the radio, trying to find its way home. "You train him yourself?" Walt asked after a while. Caleb looked at Ranger and let the smallest smile move across his face. "Some days I think he trained me." Walt gave a tired laugh, then coughed softly into his sleeve. Caleb offered the canteen again, and the old man took another careful sip. "My wife used to say dogs know the parts of us we hide from people," Walt said. She believed that more than she believed the weather report. Caleb did not answer right away. The words had landed somewhere quiet. He thought of the day Ranger had been assigned to him. 6 years earlier, all muscle and sharp focus. A young German shepherd who looked through every command as if asking whether the man giving it was worth trusting. Caleb had been newly returned from overseas then, carrying a silence he could not explain to anyone back home. He slept lightly. He spoke less. He kept his apartment too clean, as if order could make memory behave. Ranger had changed that without permission. A cold nose against his hand before dawn. A steady body beside the door. A gaze that did not pity him, did not press him, did not ask him to be fine. Just stayed. "Your wife was probably right," Caleb said quietly. Walt looked down at the carrier. These pups belong to my daughter's shepherd. She passed after the litter came. My daughter has 2 little boys who already named them before they were old enough to open their eyes. I told her I would bring them over before the weekend. He paused, swallowing. Against something heavier than dust. She lost her husband last spring. I thought maybe having these little ones around would make that house sound alive again. Caleb lowered his gaze to the puppy breathing against his chest. The explanation made the trailer feel different. The pups were not just animals being transported. They were promises. For small answers to a family that had already lost too much. Outside, the storm slammed into the trailer hard enough to make the door rattle in its frame. Ranger rose instantly, head high. Caleb lifted one hand. Easy. But the dog was not reacting to the wind. His gaze had shifted toward the floor near Walt's boots. Caleb saw it a second later. Fine sand was beginning to pour through a widening gap between the floorboards, pushed by the storm piling against the buried side of the trailer. At first it came like sugar from a torn bag. Then faster. The trailer groaned under a new pressure. Walt stared down. That was not doing that before. Caleb moved carefully, keeping the puppies secure, and checked the seam. The sand outside had drifted higher, pressing into the trailer's lower edge. If enough built up, the door could jam. Air could turn thick with dust. Waiting might become its own kind of danger. Caleb keyed the radio. Convoy, this is Walker. Sand is building against the trailer. Door may become blocked. What is your distance? Static broke apart. Then a voice came through in pieces. Walker, visibility poor, 200 yards. Following your beacon. Hold if you can. 200 yards sounded close on a clear day. In a dust storm, it might as well have been a mile across the moon. Ranger moved to the door and looked back at Caleb. There it was again. The signal. The silent question. Trust me one more time. Caleb's jaw tightened. Walt could not walk far. The puppies could not be exposed long. The convoy was near, but the storm was changing faster than help could move. Caleb scanned the trailer, then saw the tarps. He set the 2 warmed puppies gently into the carrier with the others, folding the towel around all 4. Mr. Briggs, we may need to move before the door seals. Walt nodded, fear passing over his face, but not controlling him. Tell me what to do. Caleb wrapped the carrier in one tarp, leaving space for air, then used another to make a shield over Walt's shoulders. The old man braced himself against the wall and slowly rose with Caleb's help, unsteady but determined. Ranger stood at the threshold, waiting until everyone was ready, his body angled toward the storm as if he could see a path drawn through it. Caleb opened the door, and the wind lunged inside, filling the trailer with a brown rush of sand and sound. Walt bowed his head. Caleb held the carrier close beneath his jacket. Ranger stepped out first, turned once to make sure they followed, then moved into the storm with the same impossible certainty that had brought them there. Caleb guided Walt down from the trailer, one careful step at a time. The old man leaned on him, light and trembling, but moving. Behind them, the door slammed in the wind. Ahead, Ranger's shape appeared and vanished, never more than a few feet away. Then, through the roar, Caleb saw a dim flash of amber light. A convoy marker. Faint. Waiting. Real. Ranger had not led them away from rescue. He had led rescue toward them, one faithful step at a time. The amber light blinked once, then vanished behind a hard sheet of dust. Caleb kept his body turned sideways against the wind, one arm tight around the carrier beneath his jacket, the other supporting Walt as they moved through the wash. Every step felt longer than it should have. Sand climbed over their boots and shifted under them like water, stealing balance, swallowing sound, making the ground seem less certain than memory. Ranger stayed ahead by the length of the lead, his outline appearing in short flashes whenever the storm loosened its grip. He did not pull too hard. He did not drift too far. He adjusted to Walt's slow pace as if he understood that rescue only mattered if everyone arrived together. Keep your eyes on the dog, Caleb said. Walt nodded, though his hat was pulled low and the tarp over his shoulders snapped wildly in the gusts. The old man's breathing had grown rougher, but his hand remained steady on Caleb's sleeve. Beneath Caleb's jacket, the carrier shifted with tiny movement. One of the puppies made a small sound, a thin protest against the cold and confusion. Caleb lowered his chin toward them. I know, he whispered. Almost there. He did not know if that was true, But sometimes hope has to be spoken before it has evidence. The beacon flashed again, this time slightly to their left. Caleb realized the storm had pushed them off course. Ranger realized it first. The German shepherd cut across the slope, guiding them away from a deeper section of the wash where loose sand had collected in a pale, dangerous drift. Caleb saw it only when they passed close enough for the ground to fall away beside them, a soft drop hidden under blowing dust. He swallowed. Another few steps in the wrong direction, and Walt might not have been able to climb back out. Ranger had corrected them without sound, without praise, without anyone asking. The dog simply knew the shape of safety. Caleb felt something rise in his chest, not surprise anymore, but a humility that made him quieter inside. The wind roared, but beneath it came another sound now. Engines. Low, uneven, searching. Then a voice through a loudspeaker, muffled by distance. Walker. Callahan team. Sound off. Caleb tried the radio, but static chewed through his reply. He lifted his free hand and waved, though he knew the gesture could not be seen. Ranger suddenly barked. Once. Sharp and clean. Then again. The sound cut through the dust with astonishing force. A response came from ahead. A Marine's voice. K9 team, 12 o'clock. A pair of headlights bloomed in the storm, dim at first, then brighter, two soft yellow circles struggling toward them. Caleb felt Walt sag with relief. There, Caleb said. That is them. But the final distance tested them harder than the first. The wind shifted sideways, slamming into the tarp around Walt, nearly spinning him off Caleb's arm. Caleb planted his boots and held on. The carrier bumped against his ribs, and he curled around it instinctively. Ranger circled back, pressed his body against Walt's legs, and steadied him in a way no command had taught. Walt looked down through the storm, his face dust-streaked, and wet at the eyes. Good boy, he breathed. Ranger moved forward again, leading them toward the lights. Shapes emerged from the haze. Two Marines in goggles and face coverings came running, shoulders low, gloved hands extended. One took Walt carefully under the arm. Another reached for the carrier, but Caleb hesitated for half a second, not from distrust, but from the strange difficulty of letting go of something so fragile after carrying it through fear. The Marine nodded with quiet understanding. I have got them, Sergeant. Caleb handed over the carrier slowly. The four puppies were bundled together inside, dusty but breathing, their small faces tucked against one another in a living knot of warmth. The Marine holding them looked down and went completely still. In the middle of the storm, with engines idling and radios crackling and sand striking every surface, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, because some sights command silence more powerfully than orders. Walt was guided toward the vehicle, wrapped in a thermal blanket from the emergency kit. Caleb followed, one hand resting lightly on Ranger's back. The dog's ribs moved under his palm, steady and strong. At the rear of the transport, a corpsman checked Walt's pulse, offered oxygen, and spoke to him in a low, calm voice. Another Marine examined the puppies with careful hands, shielding them from the wind inside the vehicle. One of them, the smallest one Ranger had found beneath the tarp, opened his mouth in a soundless yawn and rested his head against his brother's shoulder. The young Marine watching swallowed hard and turned his face away for a moment. Caleb saw it. Everyone did. No one teased him. Mercy does that to a room, even when the room is the back of a military truck in the middle of a desert storm. It makes strong people gentle without asking permission. Ranger climbed in last, then immediately moved to the carrier and lowered himself beside it. He placed his nose near the opening, close enough for the puppies to smell him, not close enough to crowd them. Walt watched from under the silver blanket. He counted them, the old man said softly. Caleb sat across from him, dust coating his lashes, his hands trembling now that the hardest part had passed. Yes, he answered. He counted better than we did. The transport door shut, softening the storm into a muffled thunder. For the first time since leaving the road, Caleb heard the puppies clearly. For tiny breaths. Uneven, delicate, alive. Ranger looked at Caleb across the dim interior, amber eyes calm beneath the dust. There was no pride there. No demand for praise. Only the quiet certainty of a duty completed for now. Caleb leaned back against the metal wall as the vehicle began to move, headlights turning slowly toward the convoy. Outside, the desert still raged. Inside, everything that had nearly been lost was breathing. The transport rolled slowly through the storm, its tires crawling over sand-packed ruts while the convoy lights glowed ahead like a line of lanterns trying to remember the road. Inside the vehicle, the air was warmer, thick with dust, engine heat, and the soft smell of wet canvas from the emergency blankets. Caleb sat with his elbows on his knees, watching Ranger lie beside the carrier as though the 4 puppies belonged to him by oath. Every few seconds, the German shepherd lifted his head and listened, not to the storm now, but to the small lives breathing inches from his nose. Walt sat across from Caleb, wrapped in silver, his hat resting in his lap, his white hair flattened with dust. The corpsman had given him water and checked him twice, speaking with the quiet firmness of someone used to helping people who did not want to admit they needed help. Walt kept saying he was fine, but his eyes never left the carrier. "My daughter is going to think I am the most careless old man in Arizona," he murmured. Caleb looked at him. "She is going to think you kept your promise." Walt tried to smile, but the expression trembled. "Her boys picked the names last night over the phone. Luke, Daisy, Scout, and little Moses." Caleb glanced toward the smallest puppy, the one Ranger had found hidden beneath the tarp. "Moses?" Walt nodded. "My youngest grandson said that one looked like he had a big journey ahead of him." No one in the truck spoke for a moment. The engine hummed. Sand hissed against the doors. Ranger lowered his head closer to the carrier, and the smallest pup shifted under the towel as if answering his name in sleep. Caleb felt the silence gather around them, not empty, but full of the kind of meaning a person hesitates to touch. The convoy reached the temporary command point 10 minutes later, a cluster of vehicles angled against the storm near a low-maintenance shelter off the service road. Marines moved quickly, opening doors, guiding Walt down, transferring the carrier into a medical truck where portable heaters were already running. The dust storm still covered everything, but the worst edge had passed. Visibility stretched from 10 feet to maybe 30, then 50 when the wind paused. Caleb stepped out last, with Ranger at his side. His legs felt heavier than they should have. The moment his boots hit the ground, a young lance corporal approached and looked from Caleb to the dog. "Sergeant, we tried calling you back when the signal dropped. We thought you were lost." Caleb wiped dust from his mouth and looked at Ranger. "So did I." The lance corporal followed his gaze and gave a small nod, the kind that carried respect without needing ceremony. Inside the medical truck, the puppies were being checked one by one. No one rushed. The corpsman warmed a towel, another Marine held a flashlight, and Walt stood nearby with both hands pressed together beneath his chin, watching like a man afraid to breathe too loudly. Caleb stayed at the open door, not wanting to crowd the space. Ranger, however, stepped forward and sat just outside the threshold. He did not whine. He did not bark. He only waited until each pup made a sound. Luke first, a faint squeak. Daisy next, a tiny cough. Scout gave a little wiggle beneath the towel. Then Moses, the smallest, lay still for one long second that stretched the air thin. Caleb felt every Marine around him go quiet. The corpsman rubbed the puppy gently with the warm towel, murmuring encouragement in a voice softer than the storm had any right to hear. Ranger rose, his ears angled forward. He took one careful step into the truck and lowered his nose near Moses, so close his breath stirred. The fur along the pup's forehead. The little body twitched. Then Moses opened his mouth and gave a thin, stubborn cry. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Walt covered his eyes. The lance corporal turned away and looked up into the dust-colored sky. Caleb reached down and rested his hand on Ranger's neck, feeling the dog's steady warmth beneath layers of sand and fatigue. No one cheered. Somehow cheering would have made the moment smaller. Instead, the Marines stood in a kind of reverent stillness while the smallest sound in the desert became the loudest proof that they had arrived in time. The corpsman looked toward Caleb and nodded. "They need a veterinary clinic, but they are holding on." Caleb exhaled, slow and careful. Walt stepped closer to Ranger, bending with effort until his old hand hovered above the dog's head. He looked to Caleb for permission. Caleb nodded. Walt touched Ranger gently between the ears. "You brought my grandsons their miracle," he whispered. Ranger accepted the touch with solemn patience, then looked back toward the puppies, as if praise mattered less than making sure all four were still there. The storm outside began to thin, and through the dust, a pale strip of late afternoon light broke across the shelter yard. It touched the side of the medical truck, the carrier, Walt's trembling hands, and Ranger's dust-covered face. Caleb saw the light settle in the dog's amber eyes and felt something loosen inside him that he had carried for years without naming. He had believed duty was mostly about strength, endurance, obedience, getting through the impossible without asking why. But Ranger had followed something quieter than a command. He had heard what nobody else could hear and refused to leave it unanswered. Caleb looked at the puppies, then at Walt, then at the dog beside him, and for the first time that day, the desert did not feel empty. It felt witnessed. The veterinary clinic outside Yuma sat behind a row of wind-bent palms and a faded blue sign that glowed softly through the last traces of dust. By the time the convoy reached it, the storm had weakened into a dirty orange haze, leaving the sky bruised with late sunlight and the air smelling of hot sand, engine oil, and rain that never quite arrived. Caleb carried the puppy carrier himself from the medical truck to the clinic door, not because no one else offered, but because his hands had not yet learned how to let go. Ranger walked beside him, close enough that his shoulder brushed Caleb's leg with every step. Walt followed with help from the corpsman, wrapped in a clean blanket now, moving slowly but with a steadiness that had not been there in the trailer. Inside, the clinic lights were warm and low, a mercy after the desert's glare. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic, old leather chairs, and the faint comfort of dog biscuits kept in a jar on the counter. A veterinarian named Dr. Emily Parker met them before anyone had to explain. She was in her early 40s, with sandy blonde hair pulled back, tired green eyes, and the calm hands of someone who had spent her life convincing frightened creatures that the world could still be kind. "Bring them here," she said gently. Caleb placed the carrier on the examination table. Ranger sat at the table's side, alert but quiet, watching Dr. Parker open the towel. Luke, Daisy, Scout, and Moses lay curled together, dust still clinging to their fur despite the careful wiping they had received. Dr. Parker checked each one with slow precision, warming them, listening to their chests, touching tiny paws, lifting small heads, measuring life in breaths and heartbeats. Caleb stood so still that his back began to ache. Walt clasped his hat against his chest. Ranger never looked away. When Dr. Parker reached Moses, the smallest pup gave almost no protest. His body fit easily in one of her palms. The room seemed to lean toward him. She warmed a soft towel, rubbed gently, and listened again. Her expression did not change, but Caleb saw the focus in her eyes deepen. Walt whispered, "Is he going to be all right?" Dr. Parker did not answer too quickly. That, more than anything, made the silence heavier. She worked for another minute, maybe two, though it felt longer. Ranger stood, placing his front paws lightly against the base of the table without touching the pup. Caleb opened his mouth to correct him, then stopped. Dr. Parker glanced down at Ranger and, instead of moving him back, allowed it. Moses stirred at the sound of the dog's breath. One small paw opened against the towel. Dr. Parker's face softened. "There he is," she whispered. The room exhaled as one. She looked toward Walt. "They are weak, and they will need close care tonight, but all four are alive. That matters. That gives us something to work with." Walt bowed his head. The hat trembled in his hands. Caleb looked away toward the window, where the last grains of dust slid down the glass like tired rain. He felt Ranger settle beside him again, warm and steady. The dog leaned into his leg, just enough to remind him that strong things need support too. A little later, when the puppies were tucked into a heated kennel under Dr. Parker's supervision, Walt borrowed the clinic phone. Caleb stood near the hallway while the old man called his daughter in Phoenix. He did not mean to listen, but the room was small, and some voices carry truth even when they are quiet. "Maggie," Walt said, and his voice broke on the name. "I'm all right. The pups are all right too. A Marine and his dog found us." There was a pause. Then Walt closed his eyes. "No, honey. All four. Even Moses." Caleb saw the old man press one hand against his mouth, overcome by whatever came through the line. Ranger lay at Caleb's feet, chin on his paws, eyes half closed for the first time all day. Dust had dried along the edges of his ears. Caleb crouched and brushed it away with his fingers. "You did good," he said quietly. Ranger opened one eye, then closed it again, as if praise was pleasant but unnecessary. Across the hall, Dr. Parker stepped out of the kennel room. "Sergeant," she said softly, "you should see this." Caleb rose and followed her. Walt came too, still holding the phone against his chest, his daughter waiting silently on the line. In the heated kennel, beneath a clean towel, the 4 puppies had shifted in their sleep. Luke, Daisy, and Scout were pressed together, but Moses had moved away just enough to rest his tiny head against the corner of the towel nearest the door. Nearest Ranger. As the German shepherd stepped into view, Moses stirred and made one small sound, barely more than a breath. Ranger lowered himself to the floor outside the kennel and placed his nose near the gate. The puppy settled immediately. Dr. Parker folded her arms, her eyes bright. "He knows who found him," she said. No one answered. Walt held the phone so his daughter could hear the quiet. Caleb stood in the warm clinic light with sand still in his hair and fatigue deep in his bones, watching a battle-trained K9 comfort a puppy smaller than his paw. The storm outside had taken the road, the sky, the distance, and almost the chance of being found. But it had not taken the signal. It had not taken the mercy. And it had not taken the one sound Ranger had refused to ignore. Morning came to Yuma with a clean blue sky, as if the desert had never raised its voice at all. The dust storm that had swallowed the road, the wash, and the old trailer had moved east before dawn, leaving behind pale drifts against fences, sand along the shoulders of the highway, and a silence so wide it seemed to ring. Caleb returned to the veterinary clinic just after sunrise with Ranger walking at his left side. Both of them had been cleaned, fed, and ordered to rest, but neither had slept much. Some nights stay awake inside a man even after his eyes close. The clinic windows glowed with soft amber light, and through the glass Caleb could see Walt seated in the waiting room, both hands around a paper cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. He looked smaller in daylight, but not weaker. There was a steadiness in him now, the kind that comes when fear has passed and gratitude has taken its place. When he saw Caleb and Ranger, he stood slowly. "They made it through the night," he said before Caleb could ask. His voice was rough, but the words carried a quiet music. Caleb felt the breath leave his chest. Ranger's ears lifted. Dr. Emily Parker stepped from the hallway with a tired smile and a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "They are not out of the woods yet," she said, "but they are warm, hydrated, and fighting. Especially the little one." Walt looked down the hall. "Moses," he whispered as if the name itself were a prayer. Dr. Parker led them into the kennel room, where the 4 puppies lay beneath a clean cream-colored blanket inside the heated enclosure. Luke and Scout slept nose to nose. Daisy had one paw stretched across both of them, as though claiming the middle. Moses, still the smallest by far, rested near the front with his head turned toward the door. The moment Ranger entered, the little pup stirred. His eyes were still closed, but his nose worked faintly, searching through the warm air. Ranger lowered himself to the floor outside the kennel and gave a soft breath through his nose. Moses settled again. Caleb watched in silence. He had spent years trusting Ranger to find hidden things, unsafe things, lost things. But this was different. This was not training. This was not obedience. This was recognition. Something wounded and tiny had called from beneath a storm, and something loyal had answered. Walt's daughter arrived just before noon after driving from Phoenix with her 2 boys. Maggie Briggs stepped through the clinic door with wind-blown hair, tired eyes, and the careful expression of a woman who had learned not to expect too much from the world. Her sons came in behind her, one about 8, the other maybe 6, both holding small fleece blankets against their chests. For a moment, nobody moved. Walt stood from his chair. Maggie crossed the room and hugged him with a quiet force that made the old man close his eyes. Caleb turned away to give them privacy, but he saw enough to understand that some rescues are larger than the people rescued. The boys were taken to the kennel room only after Dr. Parker explained that the puppies needed calm. They nodded solemnly, as if receiving orders. The older boy knelt first. "That is Luke," he whispered, "and Daisy, and Scout." The younger boy pressed his blanket to his chest and looked at Moses. "He is still little." Ranger, sitting beside Caleb, watched the child with gentle attention. The boy looked up at him. "Did you find him?" Caleb crouched beside Ranger and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "He found all of them." The child considered this, then stepped forward and held out his small blanket. "This is for Moses, because he had the longest trip." Dr. Parker accepted it and placed it carefully near the pup. Moses shifted toward the warmth. Maggie covered her mouth, and Walt looked at the ceiling for a long time, blinking hard. No one made the moment loud. No one needed to. Outside the clinic, the afternoon sun spread across the parking lot, turning every remaining patch of dust gold. Caleb stood beside his truck while Walt shook his hand with both of his. "I do not know how to repay you," the old man said. Caleb looked at Ranger, who was watching the clinic door as if still counting the lives inside. "You do not repay mercy," Caleb said softly. "You pass it on." Walt nodded, understanding more than the words themselves. Before leaving, Maggie knelt in front of Ranger and touched his chest with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Ranger leaned forward just enough to press his nose against her sleeve. It was brief, almost nothing, but Maggie closed her eyes as if that small touch had steadied something inside her that words could not reach. Caleb and Ranger drove back toward the base in the late afternoon, the desert open and shining on both sides of the road. The wash was out there somewhere, the trailer, the place where the storm had hidden a family and one faithful dog had refused to let them disappear. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and glanced at Ranger in the passenger seat. The German shepherd had finally fallen asleep, chin resting on his paws, dust still caught in one stubborn line near his ear. Caleb did not brush it away. He let it stay, a small mark of where grace had passed through. The road stretched ahead, quiet and clear. Caleb thought about orders, maps, radios, training, all the things people trust when the world turns dark. They mattered. Of course they mattered. But sometimes the thing that saves a life is not the loudest signal. Sometimes it is a breath beneath the wind, a whimper under canvas, a dog who hears what everyone else misses, and a man willing to follow, even when the way ahead has disappeared.